listening to, I say you are listening to, you are absolutely listening to the George Espinwald Show, coming to you live from the Funny Farm. Now, with no further ado, here comes Georgie!
I love it, I love it, I love it. Oh, yes I do, yes I do. Hey, let me tell you something. Now listen, if you don't know it by now, you're going to find out in a few seconds. Mr. Bob Schroeder, I call him the UFO man, who has been on the show. The first time he was on the show was on a Wednesday night a couple weeks ago. And right as we was getting into the UFOs, we had a major power outage that knocked us off the air for 2.5 hours. And so we rescheduled Mr. Bob to come back, and he was due to come back last Friday evening. Lo and behold, just before showtime, my son-in-law was taken to the hospital with chest pains. And so, needless to say, everyone was quite concerned, and we were, doing the family thing the way we're supposed to. And I called Mr. Bob and told him that what happened, and so we'd have to reschedule. And we rescheduled him for tonight. He's here, but let me tell you what just happened. When we get ready to go on the air, and we're live, we broadcast live every night, Monday through Friday at 6:30 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. When we go on the air, we hit a button, and that button connects us to the network. Well, and then there's a little, we call it the twirly wheel, the twirly thing. And you watch it go around and around and around and around and around. And when it connects to the network, the on-air box, the big red box, it lights up. And that lets you know that you're on the air, obviously. Well, we hit the button. Charlie hit the button on the board, and I can watch the twirly bird from over here where I'm at. And the twirly bird was going round and round and round and round, and I thought, oh boy. And about that time, a little box popped up and says, oops. And it had this little dude in that box. It said, oops. You had something bad happened. That's what it means. Something bad happens, and you weren't able to connect. Try later. I thought, oh no. What they say on Facebook? OMG. Cut me a break. What are you talking about? The aliens or the UFOs are invading our space, and we can't get hooked up. But I hit the button again, or Charlie hit the button again, and I watched the little twirly bird, and all of a sudden, the big box lit up bright red, and it said, on the air. So we are on the air, and we're going to bring the UFO man on in just a few... Yeah, me too. Now listen to me. Yeah, I know. Don't get too excited too quick here. I've got my fingers crossed. I've got my ankles crossed, over one over the other. I don't know how to make my eyes crossed, or I would. Maybe I'll cross my arms. I've got everything crossed. I'm holding my breath. I'm hoping that nothing extraordinary. Yeah, right, Espinlab. You're going to talk about UFOs and the physics of UFOs and so on and so forth, and you say you hope nothing extraordinary happens. Well, I hope no moon rot. No, that's not a good term either. Anyhow, I just hold my breath, and I hope there's no power failures, there's no health issues, or there's any other thing that can fall down upon us tonight that'll interrupt our UFO show. The third time is the charm. I'm looking I'm looking on the board. I'm looking over Charlie's shoulder. The net uplink is up. The net ping is up. The memories are stable and the CPU is okay. And so, as far as I know, you're listening to me. To all of our friends down the street, around the corner, across this great big nation, and around the world. You're listening to the George Espinlab Show right here live from the Funny Farm in a place called Our World. Email me, George C.E. That's George C.E. at Comcast.net. George C.E. at Comcast.net. And we will be sure to answer you. We answer them almost immediately. As soon as we see them and read them, we bounce them right back to the sender. And we answer their questions, or we just give them a good greeting and a big thank you for taking the time to email us. So it's GeorgeCE at Comcast.net. And after Mr. Bob is finished tonight, I will share with you what we have on the agenda for the rest of the week. And it is exciting. But with no further ado, Charlie, hook me up, buddy. All right, let me get out of your way here. Charlie does such a great job. we still don't have everything the way that we want it in here in the studio, but we're getting there. So with no further ado, we're going to bring Mr. Bob Schroeder on right. This is scary. This is scary, ladies and gentlemen. Listen to me. I was getting ready to bring him off of the hold side. I call it the ignore side. And lo and behold, he's not there. But there he is. Mr. Bob,
Hi,
I'm
George.
really beginning to wonder about this.
Uh-oh. And I think we lost the connection there. No big deal.
Let me tell you, I just shared with the audience what happened earlier when we, I call it the magic button. When it's time to go on the air and the clock ticks to the 30 mark, we hit the magic button and that connects us to the network. And when we hit the magic button, and there's a little twirly wheel that we watch goes around and around. When we hit the magic button, all of a sudden a box popped up with this little dude inside that basically what he was saying was, oops, there's a problem with connecting. Try again later.
Oh.
So I shook my head and Charlie hit the button again. And then the big box that says on air popped up and we were hooked up. And then when I reached over to bring you back, you were gone. So
Oh.
I'm really beginning to wonder, you know what I mean?
No, it's probably just one of the. You know what it is? I think, George. I think all the bad weather up and down the Northeast this year has probably really mangled the communication system, and I think that's probably what it is. I'm sure it's not the aliens, but I wish it was. But I heard a busy signal, and I realized the connection had been lost. so I quickly redialed. So it's a good thing I did. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure glad you did. Uh, I we haven't had this we haven't had this problem uh,
Uh-oh.
be, before. That's what makes this whole thing so scary. But I think we're gonna cruise right on through this thing tonight.
Oh, yeah, I think we'll be fine. I think we'll be definitely okay.
Well, Mr.
Um,
Bob, when you was here, what was it, 2 weeks ago or so, on a
yep,
Wednesday night,
yep.
we were really getting into this UFO stuff, and all of a sudden we had a major power outage. So, for those people that are tuning in for the first time, and for the people that hang out with us all the time, could you kind of go back and refresh our memory about your background and uh, tell us that episode when you saw the UFOs when you was what, 12 years old?
Yes, I can mention that. George, did you mention the name of the book that I wrote, which is why, what I'm talking about?
Solving the UFO enigma, and
It was
then
the
there's the part about the modern physics.
right, the subtitle, how modern physics is revealing the technology of UFOs, and that's and after I published the book, I've been going around to radio stations and doing talks at bookstores and that sort of thing, but that's basically what we're talking about tonight, but yep, I sure can. I can go back and just do a fairly quick review of what I started out with before we had the power failure last time. But as far as my background, I recently retired from Hewlett Packard after I'd worked there 26 years, and I was involved in operations and product management while I was there. And my educational background, I have a BA in mathematics from Rutgers University, an AS degree in aerospace engineering, and an MBA. And I also I've been studying developments in modern physics for many years. I just have a strong interest in science, and I should mention that I do come from a family of scientists and engineers. My dad was a research chemist, and he was a graduate of MIT. My wife actually is a math teacher, high school math teacher. We just we met at Rutgers University in a class on abstract algebra, if you can believe that.
Mm.
and then our daughter is a structural engineer down in the D.C. area, which is kind of unusual. You don't find too many young women in that field, but she's there. And then I have a lot of cousins, nephews, nieces, siblings that are also in technical fields as well. A number of engineers, and one sister's a nurse. Others are involved in the computer industry and so on. And but anyway, that just gives you an idea of my background. So my interest in the UFO phenomenon is not merely, looking at these reports, but right from the get-go, when I first found out about UFOs when I was fairly young, I was immediately interested in how the heck do these things work, And there's something, and I knew back in the first UFO I ever saw. I've only had 2 really good sightings in my life, so you're talking a period of 5 decades or so. When as an adult, and the first one I saw, I was 12 years old in Teaneck, New Jersey, which is a little town about 2 or 3 miles west of New York City on the Hudson River there. And so anyway, I was, although I admit I was only 12 years old, I was standing out in my front yard, and I looked up, and I happened to see this cigarette-shaped object. I mean, it looked exactly like a cigarette, except it was metallic-looking. And then directly behind it, moving in tandem with it, heading east toward New York City. And this is early November 1957. and and what I noticed, George, is that both these objects were metallic-looking, and the circular object that was flying along behind the cylinder was no wider than the width of the cylinder. And so I'm looking at this thing, and I had no idea what it was, but I knew immediately that it was something very unusual. And it headed toward New York City, and I ran inside. It was about the height. It was probably about where 5,000 or 6,000 feet. So it was roughly where the jets were coming in, heading toward the airports in New York, JFK and stuff. And although it wasn't called JFK in 1957, but anyway, years later, I found out that 1957, November of 1957, there was a gigantic wave of UFO sightings all across the United States. And any of your listeners who have happened to follow the UFO subject over the years would be very familiar with that. They would know, they'd be aware that there was a major UFO wave in 1957. And I think that's exactly what I saw. I happened to see one of these things. And if that wasn't enough to convince me that these things are real, years later, after the sighting, I was reading a book about UFOs, and they reported, George, that I kept seeing these reports where people spotted these cylinders, and there was one very good one. It occurred in France, and this guy was out walking his dog sometime in the 1950s, and he and he looked up, and it was like 2 a.m. in the morning, and he saw this giant metallic-looking cylinder that was glowing, that was up around 4,000 or 5,000 feet, so very similar to what I saw. But he said that it started to come down to a lower altitude, maybe 3,000 feet, and it was tilting on its side. And the guy said this thing was huge. He said it was at least a half mile long. And he's watching this thing, and all of a sudden, out of the bottom end of this thing, it's at a 45-degree angle, out pops a disc-shaped object, a typical UFO, the flying saucer. And then a second one popped out, and a third one, until like 7 or 8 had popped out. And each one that popped out whirled around the cylinder a couple of times and headed off in one direction of the compass until all 7 or 8 had headed for different directions of the compass. And it was then, as soon as I read this report, I knew exactly what I had seen, and that circular object that was behind it back in 1957 was clearly a disc seen from below. And I now realize that these big cylindrical objects, UFOs, must be the carriers for the more typical, maybe you could call them scout craft, that probably come down and closer to the Earth's surface to examine things and stuff. And when I read that, that corroborated what I had seen, and it convinced me there's no question that our planet is definitely being visited by extraterrestrial civilizations, and it probably has been for at least decades, but probably more like centuries or a millennium. In fact, probably even longer than that, And so anyway, that's how I got into it, and ever since I realized these things were from someplace else, I have been determined to figure out how they work. And it's only within the last decade or so that modern physics appears to be pointing toward a likely explanation of UFO technology. And that's what's exciting. And I believe within the next 5, maybe 10 years, we will be able to figure out how these things work. It's going to be based on whether some theories they're working on right now, and they're testing at the Large Hadron Collider Particle Accelerator over in Geneva, Switzerland. If these theories that they've been working on, if they're confirmed, then I think there's a good chance we're going to understand UFO technology within a decade.
How long was it? Excuse me. From the time you was 12 years old until you read about this man in France. How much time was between the two?
Not much. We had a summer house up on Cape Cod, and my family would go from New Jersey to the Cape every single summer. And so one summer, it was probably 1961 or 62 or something, I went to the Teaneck Public Library, and I borrowed a book by Donald Kehoe. I think it was called Flying Saucers Are Real. And Major Donald Kehoe was a retired Air Force guy, and he had been very familiar when he was in the military, in the Air Force. He was very familiar with the UFO sightings by jet fighter pilots, and they had been chasing these things in the 50s, and because they, at the time the Cold War was going on, and the nerves were a little frayed at the time, and they didn't know what these things were, and they thought they might have been Soviet craft of some type.
Mm-hmm.
And so what happened, George, is when I borrowed this book, Flying Saucers Are Real, by Major Donald Kehoe, I think that was the name, I forget now, it's been many years, But anyway, I read some of the stories by the pilots, and the second I read those stories, there was one story after another that absolutely convinced me that these things are real, because these objects were being picked up on the aircraft radar and on the radar on the ground, and as well as being seen visually by the fighter pilots, and then being seen visually by ground observers, and of course, George, you're old enough. You're about my age, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
You may remember. Well, you might have been like me, too young to quite remember, but you may have heard the stories. There was a lot of excitement in the early 50s about a wave of UFO sightings in around Washington D.C. And I know you're in that area somewhere, and these things were being spotted literally over the Capitol building, and they were chased by our fighter jets, and the stories they were making headlines back in the 50s, and so it wasn't very long from after. It was only a few years from the time I saw one, and by the time I was a teenager, and I was able to, I kind of knew a little more science and stuff too. Anyway, there was no doubt in my mind these things were real. And even at that very young age, probably 14, 15, 16, I was fascinated by the possible technology of these things. And anyway, that's how long it took.
Let me ask you something. If I'm wrong, please correct me.
Okay.
Back when we were young teenagers in the early 60s and kids in the 50s, and these sightings would take place, if I can remember correctly, at least the people that I was around in our city, in our neighborhood, when these things were brought up, someone saw a flying saucer or they spotted this, spotted that, you would get more eyebrows turned up, and you would hear such things as, "Oh, that's baloney," or it was all negative stuff.
You are right, and that is really too bad. Now, part of it, I can tell you part of the reason for that. Part of it is that these craft, the real good sightings that are backed, that are from credible witnesses, and that are perhaps sometimes backed by radar tapes or gun camera film.
Mm-hmm.
Those type of sightings, um, many people are not necessarily familiar with them, and so they don't know about that. And then I might add that there's an awful lot of misidentification, and unfortunately, some hoaxes out there too, where people send up a balloon with a light on it or something like that, and so so that's kind of muddied the waters a bit. But then another thing, George, that's also very important, and a lot of people may not quite realize this. That when the newspapers and the media talk about UFOs, way back in the 1950s, right up until today, one of the problems is that there's not that many people in the media that have a scientific background, and so when they see these stories, they just seem to be fantastic stories, and they don't really quite know what to make of it. So in other words, they don't. People with a scientific background start to make connections. For example, like Dr. J. Allen Hynek, who was an astronomer, and he was the advisor to the United States Air Force for their Project Blue Book, which was investigating UFOs. In fairness, it wasn't really a very thorough investigation. They only had 3 people on the staff. That was it. It was definitely, and then none of them were scientists. 4, including Dr. Hynek. He was the only scientist. But Dr. Hynek made some observations that for one thing, people weren't reporting flying pink elephants or flying cars or anything like that. They were almost always talking about flying saucers, disc-shaped objects, or spherical objects, or cylinders. And he made the connection, which many journalists unfortunately don't make. But he noticed that connection that it was a certain characteristics that were repeated over and over again, and see, unfortunately, the media, because they don't have a scientific background, they're not looking for these kind of things. They're just looking for a human interest story. So and I believe that's probably one of the major problems. And then, unfortunately, the scientific community itself, because there were so many misidentifications, and unfortunately, as I mentioned, there were some hoaxes as well, the scientific community has generally stayed away from the topic. They just don't want to be associated with something where a lot of people are misidentifying things, and there's a good reason why they do tend to stay away from things like UFOs or other unknown things. There's a very good reason for it, because jobs in the scientific community are not easy to come by, and so if you get tainted by one of these UFO things or something like that, when you're competing with somebody else for tenure at a university or something, they're probably going to pick the guy that didn't look at UFOs rather than the guy that did. And so there's understandable reasons why the scientific community shied away from studying the UFO phenomenon. But anyway, but you're absolutely right. The subject has been trivialized by the media, which doesn't really understand the fantastic, the potential for scientific discovery in the UFO phenomenon. They don't really quite recognize it because they don't come from a science background, and that's probably the big reason why it's been trivialized over the years.
Let me excuse me. Let me tell the folks about your book here, Solving the UFO Enigma: How Modern Physics is Revealing the Technology of UFOs. Don't that really sound neat, ladies and gentlemen? I mean, how technology or how physics, modern physics, is revealing the technology of UFOs, and you can get Bob Schroeder's Bob Schroeder's book on Amazon.com, and there's other places, isn't there, Bob?
There are a few bookstores, Georgia and the Massachusetts area, that carry it.
Mm-hmm.
But I imagine much of your audience is in the Middle Atlantic area.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I do go around and I talk about it. And when I talk at different venues and stuff, like clubs and things like that, I usually bring copies too. But the main place it can be bought right now is at Amazon.com. You know, and I have thought about trying to get it into Barnes and Noble and stuff, but then you have to. If I do it at Amazon.com, I don't have to carry inventory.
Mm-hmm.
But if I put it in Barnes and Noble, I do have to carry inventory, and my wife would kill me if you know, we're paying the money for the inventory and everything. And right now they do it print on demand, which is much easier for me anyway. You know, and nowadays the bookstores are going out of business, and people are buying from Amazon anyway. So it's probably the best place to get it.
Is it available? Is it available in Kindle form?
Yes, it is. Yep, it's both a print version and a Kindle version, and yep, it's definitely available both ways. And that's correct. Yep.
Great, because more and more people are going digital. Me included. I love my Kindle. It's just neat. I don't have to carry 15 books. I can only just pick up my Kindle. But solving the UFO enigma, how modern physics is revealing the technology of UFOs. Let me ask you something else.
Okay.
Not only was the eyebrows raised and the nose upturned back when we were young,
Yep.
there was a lot of secretive stuff going on with the government too, wasn't there?
Yeah, there was, George, and now that's another reason why the UFO topic has been kind of sidelined and treated more with as a joke or with ridicule. Part of the reason for it is because the CIA back in the 1950s was genuinely worried about the Soviet Union, and one of the concerns they had when they were having these UFO waves around the country, like in 1957 and 1952 and 53. One of the things the CIA noticed back then is that the lines of communications got totally jammed with these UFO reports because everybody was reporting them, both the military and civilians, and so they got so worried about that they decided to kind of debunk the UFO phenomenon, and they told the Air Force to just describe any UFO sighting that they had as nothing more, or that was reported by civilians. They told the Air Force just describe it as a balloon, a bird, or a shooting star, or a reflection or something like that. And they did that because they were legitimately worried about the Soviet Union, perhaps their agents in our country, creating fake UFO reports with the express purpose of interfering with communications in the U.S. And so, as preparation for an attack or something like that. And so the CIA did what they did for actually a very good reason, but unfortunately, it made the UFO phenomenon something that people are a little afraid to discuss or in public, and that the media now treats as kind of a joke. as well, which is very, very unfortunate. And however, things may be changing, and that's what my book is about, really. Because what's going on in modern physics, George, I believe, as I mentioned earlier, is pointing toward a likely explanation of how UFOs work. And I'll just give a brief rundown of what I mean by that. Up until the maybe 70s or 80s, 1970s and 1980s, it was thought that we lived in a four-dimensional world, that is 3 dimensions of space, up and down, right and left, and forward and backward, and 1 dimension of time. So 3 space dimensions and 1 time dimension. So, for example, general relativity is based on a 4-dimensional world. And so that, viewpoint, it was prevalent for centuries. That's what we thought. We thought we lived in a 4-dimensional world. However, in the last 20 years, several decades, scientists have been now looking at the possibility that there may be more than 4 dimensions, and that's critical to the UFO phenomenon because, as many people who have looked at the idea of space travel, within our the universe that we live in a 4-dimensional universe, going to another star system would take way, way too long with rocket ships and stuff. And so that doesn't appear to be how UFOs are getting here. But if there are extra dimensions, there might be some way that they can get here, and that's exactly what I think is happening. And further into the show, I'll explain what I think is going on, because that's where it gets very, very interesting. And this is going to change the how people look at this topic of UFOs, because the intersection of science with good UFO reports is going to change the game.
There's this stuff is fascinating to me. I mean, it just I can't describe it. The more I listen to you, or the more that I listen to other people, the more tickled, for lack of a better term, the more tickled I get about this stuff. I sometimes, just out of the blue, when I'm around people, something will come up and I'll say, do you believe in UFOs? And just about everybody I have asked recently has nodded their head or said, yes, I do believe.
That's good. Yeah.
My question is, with the secret things that was taking place in the 60s and the 50s and so on and so forth, and the sightings done by the pilots, astronauts, they're credible people. I mean, who would know better what a spacecraft looks like or does or is, or who can describe what these things do better than a airline pilot or a fighter pilot or an astronaut?
Yeah.
Going back, because when you talk about the physics and how these things work, going back to Roswell, is there, and I've read and I've heard and I've seen on television, so on and so forth. Is there any proof at all that the government actually had aliens and parts of a craft that crashed down there in what was it, New Mexico back then? Is there any proof to that? And if there is that where these physics things all started?
No, not a chance.
Okay.
You know how I know that, George? Because number one, I was in the computer industry, and I watched the development of multi-layered chips and printed circuits and everything like that. And we made a lot of mistakes. We'd try this and we'd try that until we got it perfected. We definitely didn't get it from a crashed UFO. And more importantly, it's extremely unlikely that a highly advanced civilization would abandon one of their UFOs on the ground. And in fact, I think what that was, what happened down in Roswell, I think that's a total. The talk about a crashed UFO is complete baloney, And I hate to disappoint people, but I think what happened there, they had, I think a thing called Project Skyhook, and they were spying on the Soviet Union, and they were launching these large balloons with a payload on the bottom, of course, that was attached, that had cameras, sensing devices, and what they were doing is these things would float in the stratosphere, and they would actually go all the way around the Earth to over the Soviet Union, and they would actually be able to get pictures and data and stuff like that. Well, apparently one of these balloons was being launched down in New Mexico, and there was a lot of military bases in that area, and unfortunately, I guess it developed a leak and it came crashing down, and so some ranchers found some of the debris, and they didn't know what to make of it, and that's where the UFO story came from. But then I think what happened is the CIA, they had to obviously cover up the fact that we were spying on the Soviet Union, and so they started spreading rumors about alien bodies and a disc and everything like that, and I don't think the Soviets ever realized that the balloons were being launched from that area, and that was the purpose. They were just trying to prevent the Soviets from figuring out what we were doing. However, I know a lot of people. I've heard all these stories that we get all our technology from UFOs from the 1947 crash. That can't possibly be, because the transistor was invented long before that, and for that matter, the transistor was actually invented in 1947 too, but and that's just pure coincidence. But the concept behind a transistor is the vacuum tube, like you would remember those, George. The radios had vacuum tubes, and a vacuum tube and a transistor is basically the same thing. It's really, you have 3 leads coming into the tube, and all that they're doing there is it allows you to control a current. You can it can be stop go, or you can let it go for a period, and you can create a sine wave or a square wave or whatever you want, like electrical wave, and so the radios, of course, have been around since Marconi, 1910 or 1911 or something like that, and there were no crashed UFOs back then that Marconi got it from,
right?
And so it's obvious that, and then more importantly, I was in the industry. I saw the development of multi-layer circuit boards and things like that, and we made mistakes. I mean, would do one idea, would develop different concepts. There were competing ways to do it, and so it was obviously we were the ones doing it. It's not something we got from the aliens, and then we've perfected it to today, where things are working very, very well. Also, jet engines, they were definitely developed back in the 1930s, not in the 1940s or 50s. A lot of our rockets, the V2 was developed, for that matter, Robert Goddard, right up here in Massachusetts, was doing liquid-fueled rockets way back in the, I think the 1930s, 20s, 30s, or something like that. And so clearly humans are perfectly capable developing this technology. We don't have to go into a UFO and tear it apart, and and also many people may not know this, but there have been many stories about crashed UFOs, not just Roswell. There's more stories in South America in the 50s, and in Russia there's a mountain over there where one supposedly crashed, and on and on and on. And I think all these things are just pure. I think what they really are people with a lot of imagination, and they've come up with these stories, and I think unfortunately a lot of people who are not really close to what happened to the actual, they weren't there, or they hear these stories and they start to spread, and they take on a life of their own, and I think that's what's happened. But what I'm going to talk about tonight is the real deal, or what I believe is the real deal. It's what's going on in modern physics, and if we are able to confirm the theories like string theory, M theory, extra dimensions, that kind of thing, if we can confirm these theories, which they're being tested right now at the Large Hadron Collider. It's temporarily shut down, but they're going to start it up again in about a year, I guess. If we can confirm these theories, then I believe we are going to be able to figure out how UFOs work. And the other way, there's two pieces to it. We need to confirm the theories that we're developing on Earth. And the second piece of it, where UFO researchers can get directly involved, if we detect a certain type of radiation from actual UFO sightings. And these would have to be good, credible sightings with multiple witnesses and good detection equipment. If we get these, if we detect from these actual UFOs a type of radiation called Hawking radiation, that will virtually confirm that these UFOs are using technology that, George, we are just on the cusp, just on the edge of understanding right here on planet Earth. I think within about 4 or 5 years we'll know. We'll know whether this the theories that they're working on are real, and then we'll be able to apply them to UFO technology. And anyway, that's what I think. And I can start getting into that unless you had another question you might want to have.
Yeah, I'd like to ask you this before we get into that. Okay, there's UFOs. Where do they come from? Who flies these puppies?
Okay. I believe that they're definitely coming from other solar systems, extraterrestrial planets.
Mm-hmm.
I believe that they are coming from other stars. They could be in our Milky Way, our galaxy, that is, or other galaxies, for all I know. But I'm positive, in my opinion anyway, I believe almost with 100% certainty that these are nothing more than humanoid-type creatures, probably similar to us, that have developed this technology many decades, many years ago. They could have developed it 1 million years ago. They could have developed it 30 years ago, for all,
Mm-hmm.
we don't know. But I believe the fact that I think we may be close to figuring it out ourselves, I believe this is something that I think is very interesting. There does seem to be a tremendous increase in the number of UFO sightings in the 20th century and the 21st century compared to, there are sightings that go all the way back to Roman times,
Mm-hmm.
back 2,000 years ago and probably further back. So I believe, George, that the UFOs, I think there's probably not just one civilization visiting us, but it's probably many civilizations, probably thousands, and I believe they all belong to some kind of federation of advanced civilizations, and because they always seem to avoid humans. They seem to be observing only, and and when humans approach these craft, if they're landed on the ground, they take off quickly and disappear. And I think they're under some Federation rules to not interact with humans right now. But I think once we develop their technology, they are going to introduce us to the Federation. And I think what I think is very exciting, and people should start paying attention to this. We could end up becoming part of this Federation within perhaps a decade or so. It could happen. And anyway, so to answer your question, I do believe they're coming from other star systems. And let me mention one more thing real quick.
Mm-hmm.
It's most likely that they look similar to us. They don't have to look identical, but I think they're going to be descended from primates like we are. And I think the reason for that has to do with evolution, and I think evolution is universal. It takes place everywhere in our galaxy and other galaxies. The laws of physics don't change. They're the same everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
And the laws of chemistry and biology. And so I believe that, just to, real quickly, we happen to be carbon-based creatures. Carbon, as a element, has the greatest ability to form long chain molecules, which are necessary for complex life forms. And silicon can form somewhat longer, can form macromolecules too, but not as big as carbon-based molecules. And for that reason, I believe that other life forms are most likely going to be based on carbon-based molecules, just like we are, and which means that their biology is not going to be terribly dissimilar from ours. And so I think, and then evolution, what happens, the reason why primates are the most intelligent things on planet Earth, or among the most intelligent animals, is because they, at an earlier stage in our evolution, we lived in a three-dimensional forest canopy. Now think of a cow walking around in 2 dimensions in a field. It only has to navigate 2 dimensions. When you have to navigate 3 dimensions, it's not, one extra little piece of information you need. 3 dimensions is much, much more complicated than a 2-dimensional world that a cow lives in. And so creatures that live in a 3-dimensional forest canopy, our ancient ancestors, they had to develop much, much bigger brains in order to move around in the forest canopy, jump from branch to branch. They had to develop binocular vision. They had to develop color vision in order to distinguish between poisonous fruit and fruit that was good to eat, and so on like that. And so, and then certain of these primates probably get a little bit bigger than others, and they get too big to stay in the trees. They come down to the ground, and when they first come down, they're knuckle walkers. They go around on all fours, but as time goes on, it makes sense to stand up vertical on 2 feet, because you want to get your head, the main sensory organ of your body, as high up as possible to look for food as well as detect danger. And so that's probably the biological impetus to cause these early primates to go from knuckle walking to walking on 2 feet, bipedal walking. And anyway, so I think the same evolutionary process will occur on other planets going around other star systems. And so I believe they are actually, George, going to look very similar to us. And the few credible sightings of aliens, and I'm not talking about these people, talking about these, big-headed, bald-headed things that are greens and grays and all that nonsense. I'm talking about there was because that, by the way, just for a little historic. Oh, I heard a dog. Historical context. Back in the 1920s and 30s, when they started speculating about alien life, biologists or science fiction writers thought, "Hey, what would aliens look like?" And they came out with the idea that they would have to be very brainy. They thought they would be smarter than us, so they made them have big heads. And then they thought they probably wouldn't. They were probably so advanced they didn't even need to do much walking or any much physical work. So they gave them tiny bodies and a giant head. And then to make them a little exotic, they gave them slanted eyes. And then they figured they were, these creatures were so advanced that they were bald because they didn't need primitive things like hair. And lo and behold, the what I think are the totally made-up stories today all involve these bald, large-headed, skinny little creatures, and but it's clearly from science fiction stories from the 1920s and 30s that has worked their way into the popular culture, and that's where those stories come from today. But I'll tell you a good UFO story where two aliens were noted, two extraterrestrial creatures, I guess they're humanoids. It occurred in, let's see, I think it was in Socorro, New Mexico. It's just a little town in New Mexico. And a police officer by the name of Sergeant Lonnie Zamora was chasing a speeder on a nice sunny day, and he saw a flash of light over on a mesa somewhere, going behind him. In that part of the country, they have these kind of flat-topped hills and stuff. They call mesas, and so he knew there was a dynamite shack in the area, and he was afraid that it had blown up. So he had gotten the license plate of the speeder, so he radioed into headquarters, and he said he was going to go check out the flash of light. And he got up on top of one of these mesas, and he was looking down in a gully, and incredibly, he saw this egg-shaped object on four legs, and there were two guys next to it in white suits that covered them from head to toe, and they had like visors on or something. And he was stunned, and he realized it was something very unusual. And by the way, they didn't have extra large heads. Their heads were in proportion to their bodies, just like humans. And so he said one of them, these creatures, he was about 300 feet or 250 feet away from them. He said one of them turned suddenly and seemed to like point at him, and then both of them ran around to the back of this craft. And then a few moments later, he heard a loud clang or bang, like a door closing. And then he heard this tremendous roar, and this object started lifting up, and the legs retracted inside of it. And then it turned sideways, and it headed toward a mountain range that was like 30 miles away. But to his astonishment, the thing accelerated and disappeared in the mountain range in a matter of minutes, far faster than any of our jets could possibly do. And it was also observed by some other people in the town of Socorro, New Mexico, who saw it go overhead. And when it was going over them, it was silent, but when it was taking off, it was making a lot of noise. Well, Dr. Hynek went out and investigated this case, and he went down and he investigated the landing site, and he discovered something very, very interesting. There's a rule in geometry that the center of gravity of an object when it's on ground that's not level can be. And I forget the exact rule, but the location of the legs of a heavy object will follow a certain pattern, so that if you draw a circle connecting the legs, the center of gravity will not be in the middle of the circle, but it'll be off to one side. But that will be the equivalent of the center of gravity of the object. And sure enough, that's exactly what he found. And that and then he also pointed out that this Dr. Hynek pointed out that this object must have had a self-leveling landing gear in order to have done that precise type of making sure that the center of gravity of the object was located precisely right, so it wouldn't topple over, even though the ground was uneven. So one of the legs went down longer than the others, and they were going down different lengths to get the center of gravity just right. But anyway, that convinces me that these creatures are very similar to ourselves, and I think, personally, I think we'll be joining them within 5 to 10 years. Probably more like 10 years. We may find ourselves being introduced to the Federation of Advanced Civilizations. Jim, we're not getting onto the physics, which I really wanted to get onto. But did you want to ask something else?
No, I was just going to say, if they hook up with us, we hook up with them.
Yeah.
They. I mean, we're a mess, Mr. Bob. You know what I mean? As humans.
Well, not really. I don't exactly think we're in that bad shape.
Mm-hmm.
That's a very good observation, George, and I'm glad you mentioned it. If I can I'll do a real quick explanation here.
Mm-hmm.
It's worth remembering that, I believe the Earth is actually getting much more civilized, and oddly enough, I believe nuclear weapons have made that possible, because nuclear weapons are so devastating that you don't get these crazy dictators trying to take over the world, because they now face the potential of the nation state that they're in being totally obliterated by nuclear weapons, and so the dangers outweigh the benefits of trying to take over the planet, and now with so many countries having nuclear weapons, it's kind of like a gigantic Mexican standoff
Mm-hmm.
where nobody dares do anything, but that's good. And then the other thing I want to point out is I believe the key to our civilization becoming more mature and more civilized is competition of ideas, communication. And now, like in the Soviet Union, they had the forms of communication were back in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and stuff were newspapers, radio, and television. But the Soviets most of their population was so far away from Western Europe that they didn't have easy access to Western ideas. And then, of course, newspapers can be easily controlled by a dictatorship. So the Soviet dictatorship controlled the newspapers, the radio, the TV, and people, the only information they had was what the government provided. But today, things are totally changing. In fact, the Soviet Union partly collapsed because of the huge increase of information going around the planet. For example, the Internet and global communications and satellites and everything like that. And today, satellite cell phones and things like that, countries like Iran that is run by a theocratic dictatorship, millions of their people have cell phones and satellite cell phones or satellite TV, and even though they have to hide the dish and stuff when they see the police coming around to try to take it away, nevertheless, the information is getting to those people, and it's becoming more and more difficult for any dictatorship to maintain its rule because people are getting ideas from outside their country, and that's, I think we are literally on the threshold of the entire planet of becoming much more mature, much more civilized, and I think this happens on every planet in the universe. Intelligent civilization. I think the same process occurs, and I think it accelerates toward at a time like this with the development of advanced electronics like we have today. And so I think actually things are getting better. I'll end this in 1 second. Where look at what's happened in India, for example. They were under socialist government for a very long period, and socialism didn't really work out that well. But they had access to American movies, and they saw how well we lived. They had access to American newspapers. So back around 30 years ago, they switched from this Fabian socialism over to a market-oriented system. And today, they have a middle class of 200 or 300 million people, and it's growing by leaps and bounds. India is coming into the modern age, getting rich just like us. And China, as you well know, communist China, they gave up on communism more or less, mostly more, and they've developed into capitalists themselves, and they're getting rich fast too. A few places are not, Cuba and North Korea, but as you can see, freedom of in markets and freedom of ideas is making our entire globe wealthy, prosperous, better educated, more civilized, and I think things are getting better, not worse. I think even though the newspapers, unfortunately, the news, in order for people to watch it, has to show the plane crash or the car accident on the highway or whatever. But the reality is, 99.999% of people get up in the morning, get ready to go to work, stop at Dunkin' Donuts, get their coffee and get their donut, and people live fairly nicely these days. Even though the news looks bad, in reality, most people are living quite well, and life is actually going to be getting better. We're going to have our ups and downs. The economy will go down and up and down and up. But overall, in the long term, it's getting better and better and better.
This physics stuff.
Okay.
I was on a website. I can't remember where I bounced off of, but it was the first time, before the first time you came.
Okay.
And this I call it the giant machine that does this stuff.
Hadron Collider?
Yeah. It sounds like some kind of physical disease, but anyhow. This I call it the big machine.
Yep.
And
it's an atom smasher is what the popular term for it is, atom smasher. And
I watched some of the videos that was on this website, and of course, it was far above and beyond anything my brain could comprehend. But I remember reading not long ago about how they were looking, what they call it, the God particle. Is that what it is?
The Higgs particle. Yep, they called it the God particle. Yep.
Does this have anything to do with these UFOs and physics behind it?
In a way, it does. Yes, in a way, yes, it does. That's actually a very good question. So you are paying attention to some of this stuff, you know. And actually, and by the way, George, and you can understand this. Actually, anyone can understand this. It's not all that complicated. And especially if they read my book, they'll really understand what's going on. What they're doing is the Higgs particle. I'll just explain what that is. Well, actually, I can't. I can't exactly jump ahead here because I'd better cover a little physics here first, because without I'll just do a little basic physics, but you can tell the audience there will not be any quizzes or tests.
All right, you heard that, people.
And so not to worry, just sit back, relax, and enjoy. You can think of the universe, everything in the universe, as consisting of three basic entities or constituents. You can think there are matter particles, like an electron. Everybody's heard of an electron or an atom. There are force particles, like a photon, which carries the light. An electromagnetic wave is carried by a force particle called a photon. And then there's space-time. And so space-time is where these matter particles and force particles interact with one another to create the universe we see around us. Okay? And this is, unfortunately, you do have to go through a little bit of physics in order for me to explain how I believe these UFOs are working. But the physics isn't hard. And the good news is anybody in the audience who's thinking of a career in science and they want to get into physics, there's the particles, the known particles that make up everything we see around us in the atoms and the molecules and stuff. There's just not that many of them, so you don't actually have to memorize too many particle names or too many force names, the particle force names. So anyway, we'll just take a quick look at an atom. You can think of an atom as a nucleus, which consists of protons and neutrons, and then electrons going around the nucleus. Now, the proton has a positive charge. Arbitrarily they call it +1, and the electron has a negative charge of -1. So the very simplest of all atoms, with only one proton in the nucleus and nothing else, and one electron orbiting around it, is called the hydrogen atom, ordinary hydrogen gas, like when you fill up a hydrogen gas balloon at a party or something. That's the simplest of all atoms. It's just a proton with an electron going around it, and that's it. And you need to have, in order, unlike charges attract, so what keeps the electron attached to the proton or orbiting around it is the fact that they have opposite charges. So the proton is +1, the electron is -1, and so they have, the electron happily goes around the nucleus, the proton nucleus, and they have a good old time, I guess. And we can't really see them, but we have inferred that this is more or less what they look like, And but then you can get to more. Then you can get to more complicated atoms, where the next most complicated would be an isotope of hydrogen that has a neutron, a neutral particle, which has no electrical charge, that's in the nucleus with the proton. So the neutron and the proton are together in the nucleus with only a single electron circling around, and the proton and the neutron are both similar in mass. They have a similar weight, and they're each about 2,000 times heavier than the electron that's circling around the nucleus. And a hydrogen atom that has, this is still a hydrogen atom, but it's what they call an isotope, or a variation of the basic hydrogen atom, and it's called deuterium, D-E-U-T-E-R-I-U-M, and deuterium is, I guess, from Latin or Greek or something, and de means two, and so it means two nuclei, two objects in the nucleus, so anyway, and then you can have the next one up is helium, think I got that right. It's got 2 protons in the nucleus and 2 electrons circling around, and then you keep going up the periodic table of elements, and the atoms get more and more complicated with more protons and neutrons in the nucleus and more electrons orbiting around. So anyway, but the proton itself is actually made up of 3 smaller particles called quarks, Q-U-A-R-K-S. These are matter particles. As I mentioned earlier, there are, in the universe, there's only matter particles, force particles, and space-time. That's it. That's what the universe is made of. And so these quarks are another fundamental type of particle that make up, they constitute a proton. So a proton is made up of 3 of these quarks. A neutron is also made up of 3 quarks. And but the quarks are held together because some of them have the same electrical charge, and so somehow like repels and unlike attracts. Okay, that's the way electricity is. So, or magnetism too. So if you have 2 north poles, they push apart. But if you have a south and a north pole, they attract each other. Unlike attracts, like repels. And the same thing, 2 negative charges repel each other, and 2 positive charges repel each other. But a positive and a negative charge are attracted to each other. So anyway, so what I know, unfortunately, I have to go through this to explain what's going on. Anyway, the quarks, some of which have the same electrical charge, would repel each other if it were not for another force called the strong nuclear force, which holds the quarks together inside the nucleus. And then, of course, 2 protons with positive electric charge, they're held together also by the strong nuclear force. So that prevents the nucleus from blowing apart. If the strong nuclear force didn't exist, atoms would blow up and we wouldn't exist. So it's a very good thing that the strong nuclear force exists. Then there's another force, and the strong nuclear force is carried by a particle, just like the electromagnetic force, which carries the electrical force between a positive and a negative object, is carried by a photon. Likewise, the strong nuclear force is carried by a particle called a gluon, G-L-U-O-N, and that the term comes from glue, meaning to hold things together. Scientists use ordinary concepts, or descriptions. And then another particle called the W plus W minus Z neutral, or a group of particles, carry another force called the weak nuclear force, and that's what causes radioactivity in atoms. It causes them to decay over time. And then there's only 4 known forces in nature, and so we have the electromagnetic force, the strong nuclear force, the weak nuclear force, and gravity. When you get up in the morning, you may think of gravity as very strong, but it's actually a very weak force. It's much weaker than the other 3. Gravity is carried by a hypothetical particle called a graviton. And so there you have it. Those are the 4 fundamental forces of nature. And then we've also covered some of the basic matter particles of nature, the electron, the quark, and then there's other particles called neutrinos, and there's a few other type of particles, but not very important, of matter particles. So that's basically it. But physicists are very interested in the force particles of nature because there's certain symmetries among the forces of nature, the strong nuclear force, weak nuclear force, electromagnetism, and gravity, but especially the first 3 that I mentioned, that cause scientists and physicists to believe that at an earlier stage of the universe's evolution, the 4 forces of nature were united in a single superforce, what's called a superforce. And that's kind of the holy grail of modern physics, to theoretically and experimentally reunite the four forces of nature to what existed at the very beginning of the universe, 15 billion years ago, when the universe is believed to have been created by the Big Bang. George, you've probably heard of the Big Bang?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And I think there's a TV show called The Big Bang thing or something.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, so uniting the four forces of nature can be thought of as the holy grail of modern physics. And the reason scientists are more interested in the forces of nature, they're interested in the matter particles too, but there's a particular focus on the forces because the forces make things happen. So, for example, the electromagnetic force in a lightning bolt, that, everybody's familiar with a lightning bolt.
Uh-huh.
That would never happen if the electromagnetic force didn't exist. And so, without the forces of nature, the matter particles would just be floating around in space, not doing anything at all. So, scientists have a real interest in understanding the forces of nature. And anyway, what they're doing right now, what they've been trying to do for about over a century, is unite the four forces of nature in what they call a theory of everything, that's part of what they're doing at the Large Hadron Collider over in Particle Accelerator over in Geneva, Switzerland. And all that thing does, George, all it does is it takes subatomic particles, actually protons, and it smashes them into each other in a big circular track. They accelerate these protons at almost to the speed of light, and then they collide them head-on, one into the other, or groups of them into other groups of them, and they create these massive collisions, and that's why they call it a particle accelerator or a collider, Large Hadron Collider. And when they do these collisions, that's when they detect new particles that are predicted by various theories. And when they detect these particles, they either confirm or they do not confirm theories that the physicists have been working on for many decades now. And so anyway, I'll take a pause here because I've got everybody heading for their cup of coffee or something.
Let's do this little commercial break, and then we'll come right back. How's that?
That sounds great, George.
Okay. You're listening to the George Espinlaub Show, and we'll be back in about 30 seconds or so. Alrighty, we're back, and you're listening to the George Espinlaub Show, and we have with us Mr. Bob Schroeder, who has written the book. Let me get my little dooflicky here. Solving the UFO Enigma, How Modern Physics is Revealing the Technology of UFOs. So, where do we stand now?
Okay. And I don't, how much more time do we have, George?
Oh, we probably got about another 10, 12, 15 minutes, somewhere around there.
Okay. Did you want to maybe do another show because there's quite a bit of physics to explain?
Sure. We can do that.
Okay. And maybe what I could do is at least start it right now, and and then pick up on it on the next show. But of course, my what I've been trying to do for many years is try to unravel the technology behind the UFO phenomenon. And there are two big questions regarding the UFO phenomenon. They are, number one, how do these craft get to planet Earth in the first place? Because they have to be coming from distant star systems that are 4 light years away or 1,000 light years away. So the question is, how did they get here? That's number one. Number two, the other big question is, how are these craft able to perform inertia-defying acrobatics in our Earth's atmosphere? They can do these phenomenal accelerations and these, right-angle turns. They can stop on a dime. They can do things that if we humans were inside of a craft and we did something like that, would end up as flat as a pancake on the inside wall of the craft. So they clearly understand some physics that we at the moment we don't exactly understand, but I think we are getting close, and that's of course what I'll be talking about for the rest of in the next 10 minutes, and in the next show. And so anyway, I'll jump right into it. I've been following the UFO phenomenon for many, many years, and at the same time, I've also been studying physics and looking at developments in physics, and particularly looking at the cutting-edge theories that are being tested and examined by modern physics. And only within the last 10 years or 10 or 15 years have there been developments in physics, George, that I believe are pointing directly toward a likely explanation of UFO technology. And how I arrived at that point is based partly on what's going on in science and partly from observations of UFO characteristics. And I'll tell you one of the primary UFO characteristics that made me realize that there was something very unusual going on in UFO physics. And here's what it is. I began to notice in the 1960s reports coming in that UFOs appeared to have, contrary to what you might think, they appeared to have a short-range, local, very strong, attractive gravity field very near UFOs within 10 or 15 feet or 20 or 30 feet. Now, for many, many years, most UFO researchers, including myself, assumed that UFOs were using anti-gravity, but I then began seeing reports, and I'm going to actually I'll talk about one of the reports. Wanacue Reservoir is up in northern New Jersey, and I think it was 1965, 66. And in the dark, police officers were noticing these flying saucers, the typical flying saucers, glowing, and they were hovering over the reservoir. But one of the observations that these officers made, which really caught my attention, was they noticed, George, that these UFOs were lifting up masses of water. They were floating about 20 feet above the reservoir, but huge volumes and masses of water, like a big hump of water, was being lifted up under the UFO toward the bottom surface of the UFO. It didn't quite touch the bottom surface. It was maybe 4 or 5 feet away. But there was, the police officers said there was absolutely no question that the UFO was somehow causing the level of the water in the vicinity of the UFO to rise up. And when I saw those reports, I thought, there's something not right here. The guy must not be making an accurate observation, because if UFOs are defying gravity, they would I would expect the surface of the water to be either level or pushed down slightly with anti-gravity. But I wouldn't expect it to be pulled toward the UFO. But then I began reading other reports identical to this one, or very similar, like another one which was very interesting. It occurred in Ohio, I think in 1940s, a minister of a church was having a like a bazaar at nighttime, and he wanted to attract people from the local cities and towns. So he arranged to hire a gigantic spotlight that was going to shoot up into the sky, and then he was going to circle it around just like they do at shopping centers to kind of attract people's attention. And he hired a sergeant or army sergeant to operate the this surplus army searchlight. And so things were going perfectly okay. And then a UFO, a giant UFO about maybe 6,000 or 7,000 feet, came close to the beam of light. And people on the ground, hundreds of them, noticed that the beam of light, as it approached the UFO, even though it was a perfectly straight beam, as it got close to the UFO, the top part of it that was near the UFO bent suddenly toward the UFO. Now, I don't know how many people in the audience are physicists, but in order to bend light waves takes an enormously powerful gravitational field. Absolutely fantastic. And so somehow this UFO, very close to it, probably 20, 30 feet away from it, it has a very powerful, attractive gravity field, not repulsive, which is what I would have thought. And so that was another story that I saw. And then I started reading more and more like this. I read of another one up in Alaska at an Indian reservation up there. A UFO came down close to the ground. And as it was close to the ground, the grass, the tall seagrass near the ocean, started lifting up toward the bottom of the craft. And then as the UFO happened to pass by a couple of 5-gallon cans, it lifted both of them, and they started swirling around underneath the UFO until the UFO seemed to do a little jiggle, and the cans fell back down to the ground, and the UFO rose up a little higher. And so, again, you have the observation of a strong attractive gravity field around the UFOs. And so anyway, George, I was thinking we may be running out of time. Mm-hmm. Do you want to leave it at that and then take off from this point next time?
Yes, that would be a perfect place to start. I'll write it down, but you make sure you know where it's at, because my memory, if I write myself a note, sometimes I forget where I put myself the note. You know what I'm saying?
I do the same thing. and I just want to make one more quick comment.
Mm-hmm.
This observation of a strong local attractive gravity field, extremely strong, was a critical clue to how these things worked. And in the next show, I'll explain that connection, how I realized that these things are using technology we're just developing on planet Earth. And on the next show, we'll get into that.
Okay. And I'm interested. Excuse me. I'm interested in these puppies. Like, where did they come from? How they get here? You know, doesn't light travel 186 miles per or 186,000 miles per second?
It does. However, in the next show, I'll explain how they get here much faster than the speed of light in our universe, and that relates to what's going on, or the theories that are developing that explain how the extra dimensions are configured, because they believe there's extra dimensions beyond the 4 space-time. In fact, they believe there may be as many as 11 dimensions, and I'll explain how those dimensions are related to how UFOs use those extra dimensions to get to planet Earth. Actually, one larger extra dimension, and I'll explain the physics behind it. It's really very exciting, And I think we're going to be able to do the same thing. And that's even more exciting, in my opinion.
That's amazing.
Yeah, it's going to happen.
All righty, sir. Listen, I'll drop you an email.
Okay.
I'll get Miss Nancy to check the schedule, and we'll get you booked up for a return trip, so you can take us out of this world again. It's amazing. But ladies and gentlemen, go to Amazon.com and Solving the UFO Enigma, how modern physics is revealing the technology of UFOs. And when you go to Amazon, just go up there to the little search box and type in there Bob Schroeder, SCH. What is it? SCHROEDER. And that'll come up. Amazing stuff, Mr. Bob. Very interesting. But I'll get Miss Nancy to check the schedule. We'll contact you by email again, and we'll book you up and mark your spot and come back and take us out of this world again.
I'm looking forward to it, George. Can't wait to come back.
All right. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you, George. And have a good night.
You too. Out of this world. May the force be with you. Hey, them four forces that they're trying to put back together, I think that's what the man was saying. That is some amazing stuff. But anyhow, somebody called me today on the telephone, and they said, hey, that piano music that you played last night, could you play that again tonight? And I said, well, yeah, I'll play that piano music for you. So, since it's been requested, we're going to play that piano music for you. It's only about 2 minutes long, but it is pretty neat. Let's take a big, deep breath. That was pretty nice, wasn't it? You're listening to the George Espinlove Show, coming to you live from the Funny Farm in a place called Our World. And to all our friends down the street, around the corner, across this great nation, and around the world, I thank you for hanging with me tonight. And finally, this was the third time that Mr. Bob was coming on the show. The first time we had a major power outage after he was here for about 28 minutes. The second time, there was a health issue that we had to cancel the show that night, and so we got him on tonight, and he took us somewhere. There was a few stops in between, but he took us somewhere, and this UFO stuff. You know what I'm saying? May the force be with you. No, I'm just making. Yeah, you know. I'm just. But anyhow, it's interesting, and we need to do our homework. Now, you don't have to take no test in physics or anything. You heard Mr. Bob say that, but he's getting us into there where he wants to take us. So we're gonna book him up again and bring him back, and we'll do the next part, and he can talk about the UFOs. Again, Amazon.com. Go to the search engine, type in there Bob Schroeder, Schroeder, Bob Schroeder, and the book that'll come up will be Solving the UFO Enigma. Yeah, Enigma. That's twice I did that. There's something wrong with me. Anyhow, let me try this again. Man, that's scary, isn't it? Solving the UFO Enigma. Oh man, I'm messing things all up tonight. How modern physics is revealing the technology of UFOs. Wow. And he studied this stuff his entire life. I'll be back right after this. I promise I'll be back.
Mississippi in the middle of a dry spell. Jimmy Rogers on a Victrola pie. Mama's dancing, baby on the shoulder. Sun is sitting like molasses in the sky. The boy could sing, he knew how to move everything. Always wanted more. He'd leave you longing for black velvet with a little boy's smile. Black velvet in its slow southern style. A new religion that would bring you to your knees. Black velvet, if you please. Up in Memphis, some music like a heat wave. White lighters bound to drive you wild. Mama's babies in the heart of every schoolgirl. Love me tenderly, I'm crying in the eyes. The way he moved, it was a sin, so sweet and true. Always wanted more. He'd leave you longing for black velvet with a little boy's smile. Black velvet in its slow southern style. A new religion that would bring you to your knees. Black velvet, if you please. Every word of every song that he sang was for you. In a flash, he was gone. It happened so soon. What could you do? Black velvet with a little boy's smile.
said, get way down inside you. Oh, I love it. Oh, yeah, everybody get excited. Loosen up. Kick your heels up. Let your hair down. Smile a while. Hey, this is Wednesday as far as I know. Yeah, this is Wednesday. Thursday and Friday we're going to pull out all the stops around here. I mean, we're just gonna do it. And excuse me for using the term here on the Funny Farm, but who cares if we go a little bit nuts the next 2 nights? But that's what we're going to do. We're in the right place to do that. Mr. Harry Burke will be with me tomorrow night, all the way from Londonderry, Ireland. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, all the way from Ireland. My friend, Mr. Harry B. That's what we call him, Mr. Harry B. He hosts and he does the Swinging 60s show, and he does a very fantastic job. And if you want to really get your feet a tapping and your fingers snapping, your head bobbing, and your booty shaking, you tune in to the Swinging 60s, and you'll hear Mr. Harry B. all the way from over there in Ireland, and you will hear him on this show tomorrow night, 6:30 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, and I am looking forward to it. Then on Friday night, real quick, we're going to have the crazy total tutor, Mr. Neil Haley out of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. He'll be with us. He'll be blowing in here like a tornado. He'll come in. We have no idea what he's going to say, and he'll leave. He just does that. And when he leaves, we just stand and say, "What did that man say?" But anyhow, Mr. Neil Haley, I call him the crazy total tutor, will be here live at the Funny Farm Friday evening, 6:30 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. And then after Mr. Haley is here, we'll have a guest here that has written a book, We Also Serve. And go to this website, wealsoserve.net, wealsoserve.net. The book has been written by a lady by the name of Nanette Sagastumi. I'm not saying that right. She'll have to help me out here on Friday night. After Neil Haley, the total tutor, leaves, we'll have Nanette Sagatumi. I know that's not right. So, Nanette, if you're listening tonight, please forgive me for doing that, your last name. So you'll have to help me. She has written that book, We Also Serve. Her husband was a Vietnam vet in the Marine Corps. Her son served in Iraq in the Marine Corps. And she has written this book, We Also Serve, speaking about what a family, the family itself, what a family itself goes through when these men are deployed, serving their country and wearing the uniform. So she'll be with us on Friday night. Saturday night, 6:30 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, Unshackled. We'll be bringing another episode of Unshackled to you. Sunday morning, 7 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time, we'll be bringing another episode of Unshackled. So Saturday night, Sunday morning, Monday night, mark it down, March the 4th, we will be having Mr. Kenzale Evans, a man who was convicted of a crime that he didn't commit and served over a decade in prison. He was sentenced to 2 life sentences plus 15 years, which means he was never going to see the outside world again. He has written a book, Breaking the Silence. Everybody around him threw him under the bus. And for the next several years, over a decade, he spent in prison for a crime that he didn't commit. So mark that down. Mr. Kenzale Evans on March 4th. That's Monday night. We have got things popping around here. I hope you enjoyed tonight's show with the UFOs. May the force be with you. It took 3 times, but finally Mr. Schroeder was able to sit in the chair and tell us some things about these UFOs. Do you believe in UFOs? Do you believe in aliens? Sometimes I do and sometimes I don't. You know what I'm saying? Tonight I did, and I do. I think there's something going on. I don't know what it is. I mean, I'm just a plain old person like most people, but I think there's something going on. Do you? I hope you enjoyed the show tonight. We'll get Mr. Schroeder back to continue with part 2 and take us out of this world. I'd like to see one. I really would. I'd like to see a UFO. Man, that would be so neat. Hey, listen. Whole lot of love coming to you from the Funny Farm. We care about you. Email me, georgece@comcast.net. georgece@comcast.net. If it's nighttime where you're at, have a great night. If it's already tomorrow, have a great day. But regardless of what it is and where you're at, till tomorrow night, same time, same station, 6:30 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, right here on the Spreaker Network. Tune in for another George Espinlove show. And my friend, Mr. Harry B., all the way from over there in Ireland, will be with me tomorrow night. He'll be here. Mr. Harry B. from Ireland. And so, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, thanks for hanging with me again. I really appreciate it. GeorgeCE@Comcast.net. Until tomorrow night, you guys stay safe. Be careful. Take care and God bless.